Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dennis Judy coming at you today from beautiful Atlanta, Georgia area. Hope you're having a great day wherever you are. We're about to get started on this. It looks like we still have a few people signing in. So we'll dilly-dally here on the first slide for just a second, see if we get a few more people signed in, and we'll get to the meat of it. Tell you a little bit about Dennis Judy. Dennis Judy has 40 years of experience in the industry. I have worked as a technical director for 3 different companies in the course of those 40 years. I was at Orkin, I was at Syntex Home Team Services, and most recently was the technical and training director at All Good Pest Solutions here in Georgia. Kind of semi-retired now as it would be, and doing some consulting work as well as running my own little pest control business here in Snellville, Georgia. So today we're going to be talking about pesticide resistance, and whether we want to admit it or not, it has become a serious issue in our industry and something that we need to start paying a bit more attention to. So let's talk a little bit about the background of resistance. We've been using insecticides for a lot of years, and insect resistance really has been known and documented since the 1940s after World War II. DDT was very common as a product being used, and even as early as 1947, there was documentation of resistance by insects to DDT. Since that time, a whole lot of new chemistries have come out, and usually with these new chemistries, anywhere from 2 years of them being released up to 20 years after their release, some of the key pests that we deal with have actually been found to develop resistance to these products. And probably the quicker an insect goes through its life cycle, the quicker it has the ability to develop some kind of resistance to these products that we're talking about. So what happens when the insects start behaving that way? It changes our behavior as well. We think that, hey, we've got to do a bit more frequent applications of our product. And that in itself can lend to the credibility of the resistance issue. And then as the control diminishes over the course of time, then ultimately we've got to decide it's time to switch our insecticides to something else. And sometimes we make a wise decision in doing that, and sometimes we don't. So how do insects actually become resistant? A couple key terms here that we need to look at when we talk about this. First of all, they have some metabolic reactions within their bodies. That insect can actually break down the toxin. It develops some genetics that helps it do that, or it can clear its body of the toxin totally. Within that insect, there's typically a target site for the particular insecticide that we're using, and that's at a molecular level. A lot of the products we use attack the nervous system at different sites, different receptors within those nerve cells themselves. So when we talk about the target site, it means within that insect, not just where we're placing the product. Penetration into that insect shell. They have that exoskeleton. It has that cuticle on it. The insect shell kind of absorbs the insecticide, and sometimes the insects can develop a hardened cuticle, which are less likely to absorb that insecticide. And then sometimes we've also noticed that there are some behavioral changes within the insects. They either sense that there's a problem there and they stay clear of it altogether. So we've got to think about resistance from a lot of different standpoints in that regard. So how does this resistance happen then? Basically, people use pesticides. Sometimes we are very, very good at killing a lot of the target pests. Sometimes not all those targeted pests get killed though. And the ones that don't get killed, then they actually have taken in some of this product, and genetic changes occur. They mutate a little bit within their bodies, and that allows them to start learning to break down the pesticides without dying. Then those pests are actually going to mate, And as they reproduce, they'll pass on that same ability to their offspring. And then as that cycle continues, generation from generation to generation, sometimes the pesticide actually gets to the point where it's no longer harmful to that entire pest population. If you look at the definition for pesticide resistance in Wikipedia, it says that it describes a decreased susceptibility of a pest population to a pesticide that was previously effective at controlling the pest. So these pests can evolve some kind of resistance via some natural selection. And then the most resistant specimens from that colony or that group of insect pests will survive and then pass on those genetics to their offspring. So, a little bit more about what it is. A couple more new words to throw in there. The population of any single kind of pest is made up of a biotype of that pest. So what are biotypes? When we talk about biotypes mean they're the same organisms, but they have genetic differences. So the simple way to look at this is just dogs. Dogs come in a lot of different variations, a lot of different biotypes, yet they're all still dogs. So in the insect world, it works the same way. So pesticide resistance then is just a natural ability of these biotypes of some organism to survive the exposure to that pesticide, an exposure that typically is good enough to kill an individual of that same species. So they get this natural evolution. This resistant biotype then survives that repeated exposure and it reproduces. And then the organism's population can become dominated by that resistant biotype. So if you got the resistant biotypes dominating the entire population, eventually what happens is the pesticide will no longer kill the pest. And then we have to start looking at other options if they exist. So, I guess really what I'm trying to say here is it's not so much the pesticides that are at fault. It's pretty much us as the operators, as the end users of them, not doing the things that we need to be doing with those pesticides that otherwise are very, very good products. So that brings us to resistance management. Some of the key things that we talk about when we talk resistance management is, first of all, apply pesticides only when they're needed. Again, when you over apply the pesticides, they start creating these genetic changes within their cellular structure, and then the resistance starts to occur. Follow your label directions. Simply said, we've talked about that since day one I came into the industry 40 years ago, following label directions. The labels go through a process. All the studies on these products go through a process where it's determined that a specific amount of product used in a specific manner gives you the best use of it. So if you don't use enough of it, a smaller dosage, or you don't put it in the right places, then you don't get the obvious characteristics that the labeled product was intended to use and display towards the insect. Here's the biggie, the rotation between different classes of pesticides during the year, and actually from year to year, year over year usage. I talked to a lot of people out there in bug land, and all these people have their favorite products. I always hear it. Well, I've been using XYZ pesticide for 5 years now. You can't beat it. They get their favorites, and yet if that's the only thing that they continue to use, then eventually that favorite is going to fail them, and it's not because it's a bad product. It's just because they have allowed it through the course of those generations of insects to start these mutations within the insects, which makes that pesticide no longer that effective on them. And then, of course, we've talked about IPM for years and years as well. So using alternative strategies, IPM type strategies in our treatment process can certainly help us use probably fewer pesticides or place them in better places. And that will help us curtail the onset of pesticide resistance as well. So really, it's us. If resistance is managed by us, then these pesticides that we have will remain very viable to us to use going forward. So we need to talk a little bit about product rotation. It's good to rotate chemistries, meaning using insecticides with different chemical makeups to target a group. The important thing to consider here, though, is not just changing products. It's important to change product classes. It's even more important, I think, to understand within these product classes specifically what's going on there. Some products, a lot of products, have the same chemical makeups within them. So the example given is 2 different organophosphates. If you use one religiously and you try to switch to another organophosphate, it's probably not going to work either because it affects the insect in the very same manner. So making sure that you understand the mode of action is as critical as understanding these chemical classes. So again, the issue is us. We're using the same chemicals over and over. Sometimes we don't read the labels. We don't study the active ingredients well enough. A lot of the different brand names actually contain the very same synthetic actives. Different chemical names are actually the same class of pesticides. So the example here, pyrethroids, might be called alethrin or bifenthrin or cyfluthrin or cypermethrin or cyphenethrin or deltamethrin, etc., etc., etc. They're all still a synthetic pyrethroid. So switching from one brand name to another within that same group is not going to curtail the problem. Sometimes we have cross resistance that occurs. So resistance can occur within the same pesticide class. And this again goes back to what is the mode of action of these things? Where does it attack the insect? And this is why pyrethroids have a high degree of resistance. We've used a lot of pyrethroids since the going away of a lot of the organophosphates. Resistance to one class of pesticides can lead to resistance in other classes. Let me repeat that. Resistance to one class of pesticides can lead to resistance in other classes of pesticides. Again, I refer back to the mode of action. So we found a lot of strong resistance. It's being found in laboratories. It's being found in field tests, especially with the pyrethroids, the neonicotinoids, and some of these other products that are coming to market. So I've talked about mode of action or referred to it a couple of times. What is mode of action? Its mode of action is the way in which that insecticide causes the physiological disruption at its target site, that target site being within the insect's body. So where in that organism does this insecticide act and what does it do? And when we understand what these modes of action are, then we can equate that back to how many of these products attack the insect in the same manner at that same target site. So one of the things I want to talk about then is the different modes of action. We won't go into great detail about them. If you have any questions that come up during some of this discussion, feel free to type in. There's a question box on your panel there, and you can type in a question, and we'll try to get to those questions at the end of it here and respond to as many of them as you can address. But different modes of actions of insecticides primarily. A lot of what we use are insecticides that attack the nervous system in some way. Some of them attack the cuticle production. the exoskeleton. Some of them disturb the water balance within that insect. Some of them attack the endocrine system, so that the hormones that are circulated through the bloodstream within the insect cannot function properly. And then a lot of them affect the energy production within the insect. And actually, that's what we're trying to do to control the insect. So these different modes of actions you need to understand for the products that you're using. So let's talk about those that target the insect's nervous system. And again, this is probably the most common ones that we use as pest management professionals. So how does the insect's nervous system operate? Impulses, the little electrical charges, are given off in that insect. They're driven by the movement in the ions that are charged in the sodium, potassium, and chloride channels in and out of the nerve cells. So these impulses travel along the nerve cells, and I'll show you a picture here shortly. And they have to cross an area then where the nerve cells connect. This is called the synapse. It's the gap in between those nerve cells where one ends and the next one begins. So for that insect to function, these signals have to jump or bridge over that gap. Then we have neurotransmitters, very specific chemical messengers that can transmit impulses across that synapse. Not an electrical charge, but neurologically, chemically sent across it. And then we have receptor sites on these nerve cells. And these are where the neurotransmitters have specific types of receptors that are utilized to transfer this information from one nerve cell to the next within the insect. So here you see a picture. In that top picture, you can see nerve cell number 1 on the left. You've got an electrical charge. These ions are getting sent through an electrical charge through that first little nerve cell. Between that nerve cell and the second one over on the right, you see this gap. This gap again called the synapse, floating in there. So you got these neurotransmitters that jump across that gap, and then at the beginning of that next nerve cell, you've got some type of a receptor. And that receptor will pick up these pulses, these electrical charges, and transfer it through the next cell, and then the cycle goes on and on and on. If you look at that bottom picture, you see it's not quite just that simple. These nerve cells within the insects have chloride channels, chloride receptors, sodium receptors, glutamate receptors, GABA receptors, acetylcholine receptors. They all have a different function. And a lot of the products that we're using serve to attack these receptors. So that you could actually block that sodium channel, which helps that electrical pulse cross that synapse. Or they block the calcium channel, and each of these different things has a different function. So we will get into these when we talk about the different modes of action and chemical classes, and be specific about what it's doing within the nerve cell. So if you've got a product whose purpose is to target the sodium channel, what it's trying to do is just inhibit the ability of those nerve cells to switch on and off. The class of chemicals that we use that work in this way by attacking these sodium channels are the pyrethrins and the pyrethroids, as well as the oxidizines. So to put it really simply, I tried to do that. If you look at the pictures there, you probably recognize some products that you're using. In and of themselves, I've used every one of these products with great success. They're very, very fine products. But with the overuse of them, again, you start building up the resistance, and it's time to switch. So what this is actually telling you, let's say that I'm using Onslaught as my primary, and over a period of time I decide, hey, I'm starting to see some signs of it not working. Maybe I better switch to Talstar. Well, you really haven't done much for resistance in that case. Talstar is probably not going to function either. Demand is probably not going to function either, because they both have the same effect at the same target site, those sodium channels within that insect. So you can't rotate between all the things you see on this slide. And then we talked a little bit about the cross-resistant issues. Even though the oxidizines are in a different class of chemicals, they still affect the target site in the same way. So if you're using Onslaught and you start noticing some problems and you say, hey, I'm going to switch over to Aerolon, same deal. It's highly likely that it's not going to be as effective, because these products all are attacking the same target site within that insect's nervous system, within those cells. You've got some products that attack the acetylcholine system within the insects. So it's the enzyme, the acetylcholinesterase enzyme, which causes the overstimulation within the nerves of that insect, and they'll go crazy. This was like the good old days when we used to spray cockroaches with an organophosphate, and they would flip over and spin around in circles. Some of you may not be old enough to remember those days. It always gave me a great feeling to see that happen. But a little story there as well. I remember doing a gymnasium one time and had the food service in the end of it. And we went in there, and back in the days when we were using a lot of organophosphates, and we were fogging to get the insects running. And we fogged after we did the lay down of the chemicals, and there were probably tens of thousands of cockroaches in that structure that were laying on their backs and spinning around in circles. And we decided, hey, we're going to let the stuff work on them. We'll come back early in the morning and sweep everything up. Well, lo and behold, the next morning we came back, and of those tens of thousands that we had seen lying on their backs spinning around, we probably could only locate a few hundred dead ones. So it told me that, hey, something's going on here. These things have recovered. And of course, back then I wasn't smart enough to understand probably getting some resistance. So we went in and did another treatment, and we increased the strength of our product. And it didn't work either. So just a classic example of how the resistance has affected things as we've gone along. So back to the acetylcholine system, this overstimulation, the OPs and the carbamates were in these chemical classes, but the new class, the neonicotinoids, act in the same manner. So we're probably using some of these products, Primus and Alpine, and the new Crossfire product, imidacloprids, dinotefuranons, diamethoxams, clothianidins, acetamiprids. And then there's another one that's used primarily in the turf industry called the spinosins. Spinosad is the actual name of the product I'm familiar with. But again, these act in the same way. So again, if you're trying to rotate products, you would not want to rotate from a Crossfire to a Primus, or from a Primus to an Alpine, because they belong in different classes, but they actually attack the same target sites in the same manner. So again, keep that in mind as you're rotating your products. That's the important key. Rotate not only just between classes, but between classes that affect the target site in a different manner. Another way to target these insects is to attack the chloride channels. Get away from the sodium channels, attack the chloride channels. This causes the insect to lose its neurological functions. Some of the common ones we use here, the ivermectins, come in a lot of different products. But the ivermectins and the phenylpyrazoles, everybody's favorite fipronil that we've jumped on the bandwagon with, actually attack that target site in the same manner. So once again, you have to be careful what you're switching from and to. If you're using the ivermectins, do not go over to fipronil thinking I'm rotating. Go back to one of the other classes in your rotation process. Then we've got the diamides. Ultracet is the one that you're probably most familiar with, the chlorantraniliprole. These actually bond to the muscular calcium channels. So we have a different channel, a different target organism here. And when they do that, they cause muscle contractions, which end up causing a very paralyzed look in the insect. Insects will just quit moving. They can't move anymore. Their muscles are contracting violently. So again, this might be another one that you'd want to take a look at as part of your rotation. So the calcium channels can be impacted, not just the sodium channels or the chloride channels. And then we have the insect growth regulators. Most of you are familiar with these products, I'm sure. Some of them are juvenile hormone analogs, Nigard, Precor, Alticid products, some of the common ones that are being used. And, you know, throughout the course of generations of these products being used and generations of the insects, they will cause it to lose its reproductive capability. The other class in the growth regulators are the chitin synthesis inhibitors, Centricon being one of the main ones we're familiar with, where it causes the chitin to not be able to form around the structure of the insect, and it'll die because it's not protected that way. It can't molt. So these insect growth regulators are another option that we can use in the rotation process. And then there are a few others out there that we've become familiar with, and these are the ones that actually inhibit energy production. They disrupt the cellular makeup in the nervous system and in the body of that insect and disrupt the energy production. Hydromethynon, way back when, I used to get phone calls from customers saying, hey, you were out here to kill the roaches. I'm standing here looking at one right now, and it's not dead on its back. It's just sitting there looking at me. And lo and behold, you go out and find you had a dead cockroach, died on its feet. It was just walking along and killed, you know, little head fell down and its little chin hit the tabletop, and it was dead in its tracks. Because it lost all of its energy. So, but when you look at these, the hydromethylnones and the chlorphenipeers, such as Phantom, they act in the same manner. So again, you'd probably not want to rotate back and forth between these two at all. And of course, the sulfurofluoride, typically we don't have a lot of problems with those since they pretty much kill everything anyway. But they are within that same class that affect the energy production in the insect. So you got to think of all these things when you're talking about rotation, making sure that you're switching and rotating products, not just by chemical class again, but by the way that it attacks the target site within that insect. And then we have a chemical class, the borates, which are basically just stomach poisons and desiccants. Essentially, borons are good for both plants and animals. Our bodies contain boron, but if we get high concentrations of it, it can be toxic. Boron-based ingredients typically are oral toxicants. They have to be ingested. So the insect will groom itself or consume it in a bait. And we really don't know a lot yet about the exact mode of action of these boron-based products, but there is some recent studies that suggest that it actually causes destruction of the cellular lining within the foregut of that insect, which will cause it to die by not being able to eat anymore. Needless to say, that's another mode of action that in another chemical class we need to think about. And then we have others that act via desiccation, the dehydrating dust, the silica gels, the diatomaceous earths. And one of the most common ones we're using, especially for bedbug control right now, is the Cemexa product. So these little fossilized skeletal remains of minute microorganisms, the diatoms, absorb that thin waxy layer on the exoskeleton, and they cause it to dehydrate. They desiccate. So again, another product that could be used in a rotational scheme. The key thing with all of this, though, is to remember the label gives us great directions. It tells us how much to use. If you use half the dosage rate, chances are some of those insects aren't going to succumb to it. And they're going to start developing some of these internal changes, metabolize these things, their body will learn how to rid themselves of the toxin or overcome it. And just because we didn't follow the label directions, it could lead to the resistance building up. Because then we have to go back, and then we have to put out more. And as the population of those insects increases, then we have that situation where the resistance starts to overcome. More and more of those biotypes within that population become resistant to it, and they pass it on to their offspring. So this was a study by the University of Kentucky back in January of 2014. And basically they said that given the prevalence of pyrethroid resistance and resistance to combinations of pyrethroids and neonicotinoids, there's a concern. And the concern is especially considering the diverse technological defenses inherent in the insect. So bed bugs have started developing resistance, and it's very, very concerning. Product rotation, following labels, very, very inherently good ideas when you're treating bed bugs. What happens with the resistant mechanisms when you're talking bed bugs specifically? They can start developing thicker chitin layers that, first of all, as they crawl over a product, just blocks it from passing into their body. So that thicker exoskeleton can stop the pesticide from attacking the internal parts where it needs to be doing its work. Enzymes within the bed bug itself, they'll develop higher levels of these enzymes, and then these enzymes have overcome the effects of the pesticide within the targeted system. So in effect, what they're doing is detoxifying that insecticide and living with it. And again, then they repopulate and they pass these genes on to the new members in the family, and resistance carries on. Or the nervous system is impacted, and then the cells are better able to withstand. They tolerate some of these things that are attacking them at the cellular level, and they can withstand those toxic effects. So those three things are probably the key drivers in this bedbug resistance mechanism. Repeated applications, again, back to university reports, it shows that bedbug resistance to common pesticides is really, really common. So if we continue to use the same pesticides, it's only going to cause pesticide resistance to get worse. Continued use of the products is going to result in higher pesticide rates. It didn't work at 0.5%, let me increase my dosage. And not only will it result in the higher usage of the pesticides to manage the problem, but it's probably going to also lead to the demise of that product being effective altogether. So again, it's not the product that is the problem. It is probably us as the PCOs that are the problem, and we've got to learn to put some product rotation, the proper type of rotation, together in our programs. In the past, pesticide rotation was used to manage resistance. In the past, there were a lot more pesticides available. Today, it's getting fewer and fewer. So rotating products, we don't have as many choices. So that is adding to the problem with the growing resistance factor out there. So again, how do we manage resistance? Well, rotate the pesticides. We've talked about that. Not only rotate between pesticide classes, but rotate between the way that they work on the insect. Study them, figure out what their mode of action is, and change to a class of pesticides that has a different mode of action. So that's going to require you to do a little self-study, look up the active ingredients of your products, figure out which ones are acting on the insect in which way so that you can put together a good rotational program. Certainly we want to encourage the incorporation of IPM methods. A vacuum cleaner can go a long ways to clearing up infestations. But different types of IPM methods can be very, very effective too and help prevent resistance from developing. And then you need to also explore other products that really have not demonstrated any manner in which they fall into this resistance. And that's where I'll give a little toot here to EcoRaider, who is sponsoring this program. And you need to add these into your program, add it into your rotational scheme. EcoRaider can help you overcome resistance if you've been stuck on a certain product you've been using. EcoRaider is a bioinsecticide, and it attacks receptors that don't exist in vertebrates. So first of all, it's a very, very safe product to be using. They don't have any synthetic compounds that the bed bugs have demonstrated their resistance to so far. So it can be used as a standalone treatment, or it can be used as part of your rotation program and avoid further resistance problems. So again, EcoRaider, it's a natural rotation tool. Can be used in all your pest control programs as a standalone. Comes in a convenient little 16-ounce ready-to-use spray, or you can get it the ER22 version in a gallon concentrate that can be mixed and sprayed. But they're ideal to enhance your resistance control programs. And then just share with you this Rutgers study where lab testing comparing the efficacy of 10 different products against bed bugs in direct spray bioassays. Basically, EcoRaider shows to be the #1 bioinsecticide out there, 100% control on contact of these critters. And you see the rest of these that are listed that I'm sure I used several of them along the way with certain levels of control, and EcoRaider has outperformed all of those. So kind of in conclusion, pesticide resistance in these organisms typically results from using the same product over and over. So the organism itself can select to survive the exposure as it regenerates. When we start having resistance problems, it limits the available options that we have as pest control operators. And it can be managed in several ways so that the pesticides remain a very useful way for future needs. We don't want to overuse one individual product and cause resistance problems and cause that product to go away. We want to keep these things around as long as we're going to be needing them. So I want to thank you for paying attention. We'll look now and see if anybody's typed in any questions. Again, if you have any questions, you can go down there and type them in. We'll try to address those. Okay, question here comes in, is there a site that we can go to and download the presentation? And I believe Ed Damask is going to talk to us and let us know that, it is being recorded, and our sales team out there, our marketing group, will have it available to offer it to you, and it can be applied you see the email there. If you just send an email there and request that, I'm sure they can take care of you in that factor. info@EcoRaiderPMP.com. Another question came in. Are bed bugs becoming resistant to some class of chemicals more than others? And probably the answer to that would be probably the synthetic pyrethroids are the biggest concern right now. But again, you have to think about the cross resistance features there, even with the neonicotinoids working on the insect in the same manner. So yes, the pyrethroid products, the synthetic pyrethroids, which we have the most availability to, are probably the biggest concern. Another question came in that says, is EcoRaider a contact-only pesticide? EcoRaider does work on contact very, very well. Primarily, that's the best way to try to use it, but it will give you a residual action over the course of a couple of weeks after you have applied it. So it does have some residual results out there as well. Another one came in, says, I want to share it. I think same question. Can you share the webinar later? We've answered that. How do we find EcoRaider dealers close to our locations? Check with your local distributors. It should be made available through all of the general local distributors, Univars and Forshaw's and Oldham's and Target, Residex. I think you can get it through all of those folks. And if you have a problem, again, finding it in some site like that, then again, shoot an email out to info@EcoRaiderPMP.com and we'll help you find the answer to that. So I just got a note from Ed, and he asked me to tell you that the webinar will be posted on our website. So there's a further answer to that. This webinar recording will be posted to www.EcoRaiderPMP.com. You can go there and see it there. What is the shelf life on EcoRaider? Does it sour or lose efficacy once open? That's one I would have to look up for you. I'm sure that you can take it. I don't want to put a specific number on there. It should last a long, long time as long as you keep the cap on it. But more prudently, once you open a product, any kind of pesticide, you probably should continue to try to use that particular container up until it's all gone, and then you avoid those kinds of problems. Another question, can EcoRaider be used in a preventive bedbug service? I hesitate to say yes or no on this one to the poster of the question. Certainly you could use it in case there might be something there, but if you're pretty sure there's nothing there, then it kind of goes back to be judicious with what you're using. If you're not finding anything there, should we really be treating at all? Maybe that's the incident where we put in the IPM techniques and the monitors and things like that, so that when we do find them, then we can go back and use the EcoRaider to knock them down. Another question comes in on Cemexa dust. Is the Cemexa dust still good for void treatments along with EcoRaider? And obvious answer to that is absolutely. I think probably it's a good 1-2 punch when you put them together. Treating those voids back in there with a dust product through a hand duster would go a long ways for treating inside those voids, and then the surface areas can be treated with the EcoRaider for a great strategy. Would EcoRaider be effective against German roaches? Again, hasn't really had a lot of testing done in that regard. We are looking at it against other critters. Most likely, if you tried it, you would find out that it would knock them down, if you're hitting them specifically with it. But to put up any kind of long-term residual, you might want to check into that a little further and do some other IPM type methods. Okay, our next question: has anybody had any experience with Apprehend, the new fungal entomopathogen product for bed bugs? And quite frankly, I would have to say no. I have not had any experience with that product, so that will have to be looked into. Does EcoRaider work on different types of pests and insects? And the answer to that is yes. Actually, we're looking at different formulations of it to do just that. It has shown that it has some effect on ants, and some new formulations coming out to combat mosquitoes out there. So again, study the labels, follow the labels accordingly, and make sure that those pests are indicated on those labels. But it should be okay. And then back to the question about how long should the EcoRaider last once it's open. Just got a message from HQ that says it should last up to 18 months. So it has quite a long a long life expectancy once that container has been opened. So that goes back to help answer that question. Not sure what happened to my slideshow there, but it doesn't really matter. Has anybody, let's see, since bioinsecticides like EcoRaider are fragrant, are there any recommendations on dealing with sensitivity to the smell? And again, that's where you're going to have to take that situation by situation. If you've got people that have allergens or anything like that, then certainly anything you put out there could be a problem. I've had people that have had problems with just water being sprayed because of the psycho sensitive part of it. I would recommend that if you're spraying EcoRaider, because it does have some smell that's related to a nice sweet flowery smell, you probably would not want to spray it on somebody's pillowcase. Avoid doing that kind of thing. But you would probably need to judge each situation on itself. Again, HQ has sent us another note here that says German roaches. Yes, it has shown to be effective on German roaches. So that's a new one for me as well, but you heard it here. Another question: how is it effective against eggs? I thought all pesticides except fumigant and heat cannot get throughout the egg. The EcoRaider product has shown that it will stop the eggs from being viable. It will kill them if you can contact them directly with it. So it should help you quite a bit if you can get access to where those eggs are deposited to spray them directly. Somebody saying thanks, appreciate that. EcoRaider does freeze. Does it hurt potency? Yes, like any other product, if you've got something that freezes, you want to keep it in an environment where it does not freeze. Keep the temperatures up on it because it is a liquid product. So anytime something freezes, you're not sure what happens to it once it comes out of that frozen state and back into a liquid. It may not be mixed quite as well. It does, however, have a lot of essential oils in it, which should help immensely. Another question about eggs, and again, as we said earlier, yes, EcoRaider can be very effective against eggs. I think that's the last question I see right now, unless I see somebody typing in another one. Have someone telling us that they love the product. We appreciate that. If you get the product frozen by accident, here's a note that says just thaw it out, but then shake it very well, and you should be able to get it back to normal state as long as you shake it very well once it comes back into its liquid state. and that would make sense. Any other questions at this point? I think that was the last one we had. And I'm not seeing anything else coming through. So again, think about the pesticide resistance issue when you're rotating your products. Think about the different things you can do to make things better for yourself. These are all good products, but certainly it's us that's causing the resistance problem. Do your homework on the actives. Make sure you understand the modes of actions. And if any of you have some opportunities to set up some training classes, some of our sales team out there with EcoRaider will have an extended version of this particular program as well to use that will actually go into the modes of action just a little bit deeper as well, and could be applied towards CEU credits. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for being on the call, sharing your time with us. We appreciate the good follow-up and feedback, and we hope that you all go back and have a wonderful spring season. Take care. Thank you.